The Night Squadron finally disbanded after what they were calling a pop quiz for the so-called Sword Saint. Even as they left with their heads bowed in respect, Sansui just stood there a little awkwardly, watching the crowd thin out. He couldn't shake the guilty feeling that he'd put way too many people through a whole lot of unnecessary trouble. In the quieter room that followed, the atmosphere somehow felt even heavier. The head of the Splendid family offered his praise, acknowledging that Sansui had passed an unannounced test, without any preparation whatsoever. It was a formal recognition that his role as a guardian was ironclad, even when outnumbered by a full regiment of knights. Still, Sansui felt a little uneasy. He couldn't quite see why those knights had been deployed without a real, pressing reason. The conversation shifted when the family head reached into his coat and pulled out a letter. And just like that, the entire mood in the room moved in a direction nobody saw coming. What was inside that letter absolutely blew the room apart. It stated, plain as day, that the marriage between Sansui and Brower was nothing more than a formality, and it even laid out plans about who would carry on the family line going forward. The reaction was instant and uncontrollable. Jaws dropped, faces went red, and the awkwardness that filled the room was almost unbearable for everyone present. Desperate to steer things away from that cringe-worthy topic, the conversation pivoted to Saiga, the man engaged to the Baitrable family's daughter. Serious concerns were raised about his abilities. Apparently, the guy could command multiple forms of high-level magic, and that kind of raw potential was starting to look like a genuine threat to the current balance of power. That said, there was real doubt about whether Saiga could ever actually go toe-to-toe with Sansui. The title Baby-Faced Sword Saint wasn't just a fun nickname, it was recognition of a power widely considered the greatest among all sword users, and by association, it raised the standing of every family he served. With his usual humility, Sansui shrugged it off and admitted he still felt like a complete amateur compared to his master, Suiboku. That was a tough pill for everyone else to swallow. Trying to picture someone who made Sansui, a man widely regarded as unbeatable, look like a beginner was almost too much for the mind to process. Sansui described his master as someone whose power seemed to have been personally certified by the divine. When someone asked whether Saiga might be able to pick up the same advanced techniques, Sansui shut that idea down flat. There was simply no way that was happening anytime soon. He explained that even the most basic techniques he'd learned required 500 years to truly master. Not the kind of thing anyone could just copy after watching it once or twice. But right in the middle of that conversation, Sansui suddenly tensed. He felt a presence. Something out there was powerful, and it definitely wasn't human. That instinct proved right when an elaborate horse-drawn carriage rolled up to the front of the estate. The tension in the room jumped right back up as everyone exchanged glances and decided, together, to head outside and greet whoever was arriving with that kind of overwhelming aura. A visitor who clearly came with a very specific purpose in mind. The figure that stepped out immediately turned the atmosphere electric. With a confidence that bordered on arrogance, this person made it clear they weren't there for anything small. Their whole presence suggested that whatever had brought them here was something far bigger than a casual visit. Standing there with unmistakable pride, Saiga held an extraordinary weapon. He had just been officially recognized as the rightful owner of a sacred blade, one of 8 legendary divine relics. And the look on everyone's face when they realized what they were seeing said everything. A blinding flash of light burst from the sword, forcing everyone to shield their eyes and look away. Something was happening that went completely beyond human understanding, right there in front of them, and it marked the awakening of the sword's true power. Then, shockingly, the sword transformed into a small girl who introduced herself as Ekasax. She announced herself without a shred of modesty as the most powerful sword ever created by God. The moment she said it, Sansui felt a wave of recognition, a reminder of the deity who had sent him to this world in the first place. Armed with her new weapon, Saiga wasted no time throwing down a challenge to Sansui. A month of intense training, he figured, was more than enough payback for the humiliation he'd suffered last time. But for both Sansui and Brower, a whole month as preparation for a rematch sounded almost laughably short. The story flashes back to the Baitrable estate, right after that first encounter. Saiga was devastated. He hadn't even managed to leave a single scratch on Sansui. Brower's father saw the despair written all over the young man's face, and decided it was time to hand him something he'd been holding on to, a secret. The father could see that Saiga's rare talent was going to waste if he kept spiraling in frustration. He opened a small box and revealed an ancient map inside, a map that represented something Saiga had been chasing his whole life. The chance to reach a level of power that felt completely out of reach. The map pointed to the hidden location of Ekisox, the most powerful sacred sword ever documented in history. A legend now suddenly within arm's reach, offering a shortcut to a kind of strength most people couldn't even imagine. The history of that sword was staggering. It was said to have existed long before any kingdom was ever founded, and it had once been wielded by a swordsman who single-handedly brought an entire nation to its knees. With that kind of fire burning in his chest, Saiga became absolutely certain holding that blade was the only way he'd ever surpass the Sword Saint. The long search eventually brought them to the mouth of a cave, dark, foreboding, and draped in a silence that felt almost alive. There it was, half hidden behind thick forest, radiating an aura of darkness that seemed to warn anyone approaching. Turn back now. They stepped inside, footsteps swallowed by the quiet of the cave, until their eyes landed on a sword standing upright on a pile of stones. This was it, the legendary sacred blade. But the moment they arrived, a voice echoed through the darkness. A consciousness was awakening from within the sword, already fully aware that yet another soul had come looking for its power. Saiga laid it all out without hesitation. There was someone he absolutely had to defeat, no matter what it took. The sword responded with what could only be described as a dismissive sigh, as if it had heard that speech 1,000 times before and found it nothing compared to the warrior who had sealed it away here. Not about to be talked down to, Saiga pushed back. He wasn't just anyone. He carried the blessing of a god. That claim finally sparked something in the sword's interest, curious enough to test the resolve of the young man standing before it. A massive surge of energy erupted as the seal finally broke. Overflowing with joy, Saiga grabbed hold of the legendary weapon. But this small victory was just the opening act. The real test was waiting for him out in the open world. Back in front of the grand estate, the air went still the moment Saiga stepped into position. He stood across from Sansui, and the crowd around them watched in barely contained anticipation, all of them wondering the same thing. What was about to happen? The fight kicked off immediately. Saiga called on the full power of his sacred blade, Ekisox, right from the start. He was visibly confused that Sansui hadn't even drawn his sword yet, but that didn't slow him down. He was going all in from the very first second. An extraordinary transformation began to sweep over Saiga's body. His magic surged and roared, amplified to an almost frightening degree by Ekisox's unique ability to multiply its user's energy output. Encased in armor of pure light and driven by an intensity that could burn through steel, Saiga felt like he had finally reached the top of his power. And it wasn't just raw strength. His ability to see moments into the future sharpened dramatically. Saiga could now predict movements several seconds before they happened. With that advantage, he felt completely untouchable. He locked his gaze onto his target and launched his finishing strike. A devastating storm of fire crashed forward. But here's the thing about seeing the future. It doesn't free you from it. Being able to predict what was coming only meant Saiga was forced to react to it in real time, with no room to rethink, no room to change course. All that speed, all that firepower, and it didn't matter. With one impossibly precise, almost casual shift of his foot, Sansui redirected Saiga's entire momentum. In the span of a single breath, Saiga's own devastating force was turned against him and sent him crashing hard into the ground. The grip gave way. The sacred sword that Saiga had been so proud of just moments ago was now in someone else's hands. Sansui stood calmly, holding it, having demonstrated complete dominance without ever needing to break a sweat.
Saiga's defeat was total, but the real reason he lost wasn't simply a matter of power levels. It was a lack of proper training, compounded by the brutal fact that he had walked straight into the worst possible matchup for his entire fighting style. The whole thing was over almost before it started. Saiga lay there, unable to move, the full weight of it sinking in. Every single move he had made, and every calculated step, had been read completely from the very beginning. It all went down exactly as Sansui had predicted from the moment the fight started. The crowd stood in stunned silence. Nobody could wrap their head around how someone as formidable as Saiga had been put down that fast. Meanwhile, the spirit inside the sacred sword appeared genuinely shaken, even tearful, as if it had just witnessed something that went far beyond what it expected. The secret behind Sansui's technique started to come to light. That light-footed movement of his didn't just affect his own body, it extended to anything he touched. The moment he made contact with Saiga, he had shifted the weight and balance of his opponent, turning that overwhelming attack into a force that knocked Saiga straight off his own feet. Disbelief rippled through the entire crowd, including the head of the family, who couldn't fathom how raw power on that scale could be neutralized with a single touch. And while Saiga was still trying to make sense of what had happened, the spirit of the sword Ekisax was completely fixated on Sansui, as if she recognized the fingerprints of a technique she had seen somewhere before. With a trembling voice, the sword's spirit finally placed it. That flawless movement, that perfect, errorless execution, could only belong to one kind of person, a student of Suiboku. Ekisax broke down in tears, the memory flooding back of the day her master had left her behind to chase a path towards something greater, alone. But Sansui's face showed nothing but confusion at the mention of that name, leaving behind a question mark about a past that had never been shared with him. The conversation shifted to the previous owner of the sword, a figure said to have lived long before this kingdom was ever established. Buried inside that history was a deep mystery about the timeline and about where a man like Suiboku actually fit into it. Doubt began to creep in. Given how ancient this kingdom's history already was, the idea that someone from that era could still be alive today seemed flat out impossible. And yet, what they had just watched with their own eyes was living proof of a power that didn't play by the rules of ordinary human existence. The possibility that Sansui's master was somehow a descendant of the sword's original owner sounded completely absurd, especially given that Suiboku was known to be a solitary hermit. But the truth slowly surfacing was shaking something loose, exposing fragments of a history that didn't quite line up with what everyone thought they knew about the present. In the darkness of a cave, a quiet apology was spoken to someone named Sakuzu. The figure standing with their back to the light gripped a sword tightly, carrying a weight of emotion too heavy to put into words in a place that heavy with silence. The driving desire to become the strongest, without depending on anyone or anything else, was the reason behind it all. The sword was left behind, standing still in the stone, as footsteps slowly walked away from a past that had been decided. There was a moment of hesitation, but the resolve held and he kept going. Sobs broke through as the plea to not leave went completely unanswered. The grief was raw and real, leaving a wound that those who witnessed it could feel in their chests. The others around them could only fall silent, trying to make sense of a pain that had just made the room completely different. The explanation that a hermit could live for thousands of years left everyone speechless. That single piece of information seemed to shatter whatever logical framework they'd been relying on, and the looks on their faces made it clear that none of them knew how to process the existence of someone who had simply outlived every human boundary. With urgency rising in her voice, the girl demanded answers from the young man identified as Suiboku's student. Sansui, steady as ever, began to acknowledge that the master they were describing was almost certainly the same person, even though he himself had never heard of them before this moment. When asked how old he actually was, Sansui genuinely struggled to give a straight answer. He didn't have a clear memory of exactly how long he'd been alive, but somewhere in the blur, a flash of the past came back to him, a younger version of himself swinging a wooden sword alone in the middle of a forest. When he admitted he had been training under his master's guidance for roughly 500 years, the room went completely still. A number that impossible just hanging in the air made every single person freeze. No one could find words for what it meant to spend that much time doing nothing but training. Back inside the quiet mansion, a feeling of betrayal started to surface. Keeping something that significant a secret felt like a serious breach of trust, even as a few voices in the room tried to defend him by pointing out that there was never any bad intention behind his silence. The Baron stepped in with measured calm. As hard as it was to process logically, 5 years of knowing this person had earned him at least the benefit of the doubt. But from here on out, there could be no more hiding anything. Sansui was going to have to lay everything out on the table, no exceptions. And so the truth began to pour out. Starting from the very beginning, being born in a completely different world, his accidental death caused by a mistake made by the deity who created Ekisax, how he ended up as Suiboku's student by that same god's instruction, and how he spent 5 centuries doing nothing but sharpening his swordsmanship. That long journey eventually brought him to reign, a chance encounter in the middle of a forest. The Baron chose to believe him, not just because of the words, but because of the strength and the character Sansui had shown over the years of them knowing each other. It was a moment of relief, finally letting the truth breathe after keeping it buried for so long. The title, Babyface Sword Saint, suddenly made a whole lot more sense, but one question still lingered. Was it really true that after all that time, he had only mastered 4 techniques? Sansui swore on it. That was the full truth, and there was nothing else he was holding back. Fresh disbelief hit the room. 500 years, and only 4 techniques to show for it? For anyone who hadn't lived inside the logic of ancient hermit training, this was truly impossible to rationalize. Right in the middle of all that confusion, Rain suddenly decided there was something very personal she needed to ask her father. Her innocent question about why he had chosen her name ended up landing in a very unexpected place. Sansui admitted completely honestly that the name Rain had simply popped into his head in the moment. No deep meaning, no long thought behind it. It just came to him. That honest answer hurt. Rain shouted that she hated him and bolted out of the room. The Baterable Mansion's evening had become the quiet witness to this little family drama, while the deeper conversation about who Sansui really was continued inside without missing a beat. For a hermit of Sansui's caliber, 500 years was apparently still considered very young. That shift in perspective hit the room hard, a reminder of just how enormous the gap was between regular people and someone like Sansui. Suddenly, all that extraordinary strength had a perfectly logical explanation behind it. The old legends about hermits who could lift mountains and bend the weather to their will, not fairy tales. Suiboku had actually done those things. Hearing that out loud made everyone's skin crawl a little, because it meant the person standing in front of them was the student of someone who had walked straight out of legend and into real life. Saiga felt the full weight of embarrassment crash down on him. He'd been out here bragging about 1 month of training in front of someone who had spent 5 centuries at it. On the other side of the conversation, a bigger question had started forming. Why would a hermit of that magnitude choose to become a guardian for someone like Dewey? A heavy quiet settled over the room when the challenge to face the hermit student again was thrown out there. Saiga could only sit in silence, a cold sweat breaking across his skin, finally grasping just how different a level he'd been playing on compared to the one Sansui actually occupied. Then the outburst came. Tsuga couldn't hold it in anymore. She insisted, firmly and without apology, that this had to stop. Grabbing Saiga's hand tightly, she begged him, genuinely begged, to stop going after Master Sansui. The fear of losing him and the pain of watching someone she cared about keep getting hurt had finally pushed her past any concern for formality. The memory of those crushing defeats played through her mind like a loop, and the gap between their levels of ability was painfully clear. Tsuga asked out loud what everyone else had been quietly thinking for a while now. Wasn't losing 3 times already enough to make the point? It was the most honest question anyone in that room had been brave enough to say. In a steadier, but no less firm voice, Tsuga laid out the hard reality. Defeating the student of someone like Suiboku meant mastering rare and advanced forms of magic and dedicating decades of your life to training. She urged Saiga, practically demanded, that he make a promise to stop going after Sansui. Looking into Tsuga's eyes and seeing how serious she was, Saiga finally gave in and agreed to let it go. That night, Saiga sat alone on the dormitory steps, staring down at the hands resting in his lap, hands that still felt weak. The mention of hundreds of years of training kept playing on repeat in his head. 500 years. The distance between them wasn't just big. It was the kind of gap that no amount of pure motivation could ever close on its own. A few days had passed since the duel. In one of the quieter corners of the campus, the mood felt relaxed, but a little awkward. Sansui was now on the receiving end of a very different kind of challenge, a very serious lecture from little Rain, while his employer sat off to the side, watching calmly over a cup of tea. Rain was upset, but not about the fact that they didn't share blood. She had known that for a long time. What had her fuming was that her name had been handed to her on a whim, without a single second of thought. To her, a name wasn't just a label, it was an identity. It was sacred. You don't just pick one in the moment, like it's nothing. Sansui could only bow his head and apologize for what he now recognized as a pretty thoughtless moment from the past. Rain made it clear that she actually loved her name. She just couldn't stand the way it had been decided. Right in the middle of that father-daughter back and forth, a knock at the door broke the tension. Their longtime rival, Dewey, had come to visit. But this visit felt completely different from any before it. Head bowed low, Dewey openly finally admitted his defeat. That was a surprise to just about everyone in the room, given how stubbornly he'd refused to accept reality through 3 straight losses. It seemed like he had finally reached the moment where his ego simply couldn't argue with the facts anymore. Dewey acknowledged that his stubbornness had done nothing but make things harder for the people around him. He was starting to understand that knowing when to walk away and owning your limits is its own kind of growth. When someone asked him what had been driving all those reckless challenges, he answered plainly. He just refused to believe he could lose. Looking back on it, even he had to admit it was a little ridiculous. But that was behind him now. Dewey had made a decision. His strength was going to be used to protect others, not feed his own pride. Even if his most powerful strike, had it connected, could have erased Sansui without a trace, he chose to bury that dark ambition for good. The conversation drifted toward a deeper topic, the figure of Suiboku himself. Zuga shared her complicated feelings about seeing the student of a hermit. That legendary choose to serve someone ordinary, genuine curiosity, started bubbling up about what kind of person the legendary master really was, since even Sansui struggled to picture what his teacher might have been like in his younger years. Tsuga hesitated a little, aware that Sansui was right there in the room, but went ahead and shared her honest perspective. To her, Suiboku was the definition of pride and ambition. He wasn't the type to bow to anyone, not to any person, not under any sky. His personality, she explained, was explosive in every sense of the word. More kingdoms than anyone could count had been reduced to ash simply because someone managed to tick him off. Hearing all of this, Sansui broke out in a cold sweat, realizing just how terrifying his master's reputation actually was out in the wider world, especially compared to the version of him Sansui saw every day. Suiboku's anger, they said, had a way of bleeding into nature itself, triggering volcanic eruptions, turning dense forests into scorched wasteland, sometimes just as a side effect of his own training. He was less of a person and more like a walking natural disaster. Sansui could only manage a strained smile and confirm that, yeah, his teacher had a habit of doing completely unhinged things on a regular basis. But for Rain, the whole story just made everything cooler. Having a dad who was literally the student of someone like that was something to brag about. While Rain basked in the excitement, Sansui quietly gazed toward the forest and wondered how his teacher was doing out there. Far away in a quiet and forgotten place, there was an unmarked pile of stones sitting in the middle of overgrown brush, something that could easily pass for a forgotten grave. 2 mysterious cloaked figures were doing something there, until a man's voice appeared behind them, out of nowhere, and interrupted. He warned them in a casual tone that grave robbing wasn't exactly an admirable pursuit. Even as both strangers immediately reached for their weapons and tensed up, the man stayed perfectly calm and asked them to lower their blades, because he already knew they were something more than ordinary hired swords. Turns out, the 2 of them had come to find out who was buried there. The man explained that 5 years ago, a woman carrying a baby with silver hair had been attacked by wolves at this very spot. By the time he found her, it was too late to save her, so he had buried her there himself. As for the silver-haired baby, the man offered a reassuring answer. The child was being looked after by his student and was most likely growing up safe in the world of humans, far away from the dangers of this forest. Once the 2 cloaked visitors had gone, the man exhaled, relieved they'd been willing to talk things out without anyone having to get hurt. Tilting his face toward the clear sky above, he muttered quietly to himself, wondering how his student was holding up out there, raising that child in the world beyond the trees. Inside the headmaster's office, an important report was delivered with a heavy tone. The search for this mysterious individual had completely dead-ended. Not a single trace, not the faintest clue about who they actually were. The headmaster responded with quiet composure, well aware of how quickly a rumor could take on a life of its own. To him, a loose piece of gossip was like moths in a jar. Once the lid comes off, they scatter in every direction, faster than anyone can follow. The focus shifted to Shirokuro Sansui. The idea that he was a swordsman who had been alive for over 500 years was admittedly a lot to swallow, but given the depth of what he was capable of, it was starting to make an unsettling kind of sense. Even granting that Master Saiga was extraordinarily skilled, he still fell short of matching Sansui. A long gaze stretched past the window as the headmaster weighed the situation carefully. Saiga may well have surpassed the royal family's personal guards in raw ability, but there was still room for that young man to grow. The royal family simply could not afford to fall behind and needed to find a protector who could genuinely stand on equal footing. The ambition that followed was clear. Out there somewhere, there had to be someone with the kind of extraordinary power and capability to stand as a true rival to the man they called the Lightning Blade, Sansui himself. Meanwhile, back at the Dewey estate, things felt a little lighter, but the topic du jour was still hard to get around. The fact that Sansui had apparently been alive for 5 whole centuries was just not something people could absorb easily. The young lady offered an apology for having kept that secret for as long as she had, and honestly, the whole arranged marriage situation with Brower now had to be reconsidered. Because how exactly do you go ahead with marrying someone who is, technically speaking, a 500-year-old in a young man's body? But here's the thing that made it even more complicated. Sansui was going to look exactly the same decades from now as he did today. That gap between age and appearance made an already tricky conversation about marriage even harder to resolve, and they ultimately agreed to put it on hold for the time being. Frustration was beginning to build in the young lady's mind. She made a firm decision. She was going to find her own companion for the Splendid family, someone powerful with a clear and honorable background, who carried himself well and who wouldn't cause her any embarrassment along the way. Sansui gave a tight smile at the ambition, privately doubting any man was going to make it past her father and brother, who were notoriously protective, and get anywhere near her. Right in the middle of that thought, a messenger from the Caputo family arrived with an urgent message. There was something that needed to be delivered directly, and immediately into the hands of Lady Dewey Sapede herself. The letter turned out to be from Pallet Caputo. Written in a rush, it had the young lady leaning in with curiosity the moment she began to open it. Inside, Pallet apologized for not being able to come in person. She wrote about the arrival of a foreign swordsman, exceptionally gifted, who was now demanding to be brought before the strongest warrior the kingdom had to offer. Pallet was absolutely certain that Sansui was the only person capable of stopping him. That's why she was reaching out, urging them all to come to the Caputo territory right away and to bring the Sword Saint with them. As one of the 4 great noble families, a request from the Caputo house was never something to take lightly. Even with the urgency of the situation hanging in the air, the young lady found herself leaning into a different angle entirely, asking whether this foreign swordsman happened to be handsome and well-built. The messenger's answer, young, powerful, and honorable, instantly lit the young lady up. Strong and good-looking? That sounded like a pretty perfect combination to her. Without wasting another second, she ordered the whole group to get ready and head to the Caputo estate immediately. Arriving in Caputo territory, they were greeted by the familiar noise of a busy town. A guard quickly stepped up and directed the group toward Lady Pallet, who was already waiting for them. On the way, some conversation naturally drifted to why the young lady still didn't have a fiancé. The answer, as it turned out, came down to her father and brother, whose overprotectiveness had kept every potential suitor at a comfortable distance, which was a bit ironic since the young lady herself had never really shown much interest in anyone before. Rain was genuinely curious whether this foreign swordsman might end up liking their lady. Brower and Sansui could only respond with quiet uncertainty, both of them sensing that matters of the heart and matters of strength weren't exactly going to line up in a nice, neat way. Their steps slowed as they came across a large crowd gathered around something in the middle of the street. A fight was happening between a local noble and the foreign swordsman, and every person standing there was burning with the same question. Just how strong was this man who had come from so far away? The foreign man stood with a confidence that pulled every eye in the crowd toward him like gravity. He told the soldiers in front of him in a flat, almost bored tone that fighters at their level were never going to land a hit on him. Off to the side, Sir Nuri groaned in frustration as he surveyed his forces, completely laid out flat on the ground, while the foreigner stood there without a single mark on him. The sight had the young lady visibly flustered, her admiration barely concealed. Sansui, meanwhile, felt mildly irritated, like the whole universe had just arranged itself to make this guy look incredible. The man's presence absolutely owned the space. Then the young lady noticed Sansui's group group and called out to them with unmistakable energy. In the middle of the rising tension, Palette Caputo appeared and apologized for the short notice. She quickly confirmed with the group whether what was happening right in front of them was connected to the letter she had sent earlier. The root of it all came out. The foreign man, named Toon, had gotten into a serious dispute with Sir Nuri, a nobleman from the Domino Empire. Both of them were standing firm on being in the right and refusing to settle things in court. The Domino Empire itself, a neighboring country to the Kingdom of Arcana, had recently been rocked by a major revolution. The upheaval there had sent the imperial family into custody, while the remaining nobles scattered and fled for refuge wherever they could find it, including Arcana. Since none of them were criminals, they were welcomed. But now conflicts were breaking out all over the place for reasons that weren't immediately clear. Sir Nuri had even brought his own private soldiers to take on Toon, only to end up humiliated. The young lady's take? Send the disgraced nobleman back to Domino and be done with it. But Palette pushed back on that. They couldn't afford to rush into anything. Both sides deserved to be heard before anyone could determine what was actually true. Toon, for his part, made it plain that he wasn't going anywhere willingly. If they wanted him to talk, they were going to have to earn the right by beating him in a fight. Toon then turned his attention to Sansui, addressing him by the title the world had given him, the baby-faced Sword Saint, or whatever people were calling him these days. The young lady immediately pushed Sansui forward, but with one condition: he couldn't let Toon get seriously hurt. Palette echoed the same request, hoping Sansui would go easy on him. Sansui agreed without much fuss and reached for his wooden sword, while little Rain cheered her dad on with everything she had. On the other side, Sir Nuri scoffed at Sansui. To him, this unassuming-looking young man had no shot against someone who had already taken out his best soldiers. He didn't believe for 1 second that holding back was going to be realistic in a fight like this, but Nuri was already running his own calculations in the background. Either outcome, he figured, worked out in his favor. If Sansui got taken down, Toon would face consequences for harming someone important, and if Sansui turned out to be extraordinarily powerful and Toon ended up losing, well, that problem disappeared permanently. A neat little win-win from where he was standing. Before things got started, Toon introduced himself with the kind of easy energy that suggested he genuinely enjoyed this, then asked for his opponent's name. Sansui answered politely, Shirokuro Sansui. Around them, the crowd was beginning to pick up on something, an aura rolling off Toon that was hard to ignore. The young lady kept remarking on how incredible Toon was. Strength, presence, the whole package. Rain, completely undeterred by any of it, just kept yelling encouragement at her dad, fully convinced Sansui was going to win this. The duel began. Toon rushed in immediately with a technique he called the Loyal Shadow Dance. His movements were blindingly quick and deliberately disorienting, creating the illusion of being everywhere at once, making it nearly impossible for anyone to pinpoint where he actually was. The crowd gasped as Toon appeared to split into two versions of himself. Strike after strike came flying in at incredible speed, and yet, with a calmness that seemed almost supernatural, Sansui blocked every single one without moving an inch from where he stood. Toon kept shifting, kept hunting for an opening from every angle he could find. He escalated his technique into something called the Trapping Shadow Dance. His after images, now so convincing and aggressive, they looked genuinely dangerous. Steel rang out again and again as the fight raged. Toon launched himself from above, and Sansui caught it cleanly, then pushed Toon back with enough force to make him take notice. Sansui's steady, unshakable strength was beginning to register. This wasn't just anyone he was up against. Palette and the young lady realized Toon was using some kind of rare magic capable of generating perfect copies of himself. Even so, they couldn't help being amazed at how well Sansui was keeping pace with something that advanced. While staying sharp and composed, Sansui began mapping the weaknesses in his opponent's approach. He noticed that Toon's strategy was built on volume, overwhelming with numbers, but that precise focused control only worked when he was operating with a single shadow. As a fighter, Sansui placed Toon slightly above Brower when raw physical strength was factored in. A genuinely skilled swordsman, Toon felt something shift inside him. The long journey away from his homeland hadn't been for nothing. He hadn't expected to find someone like Sansui here. Sensing he'd finally found a worthy opponent, Toon decided it was time to pull out the ability he'd never shown anyone before. With a war cry, Toon released his ultimate technique. This time, the number of shadow copies that appeared was on a completely different scale than anything before, surrounding Sansui from all directions. The crowd erupted in shock, unable to believe what they were seeing. Toon unleashed his signature move, move, the true shadow dance. This series of attacks was designed specifically to exploit reaction time, using waves of duplicates coming from every direction simultaneously. For any normal fighter, that kind of pressure from all sides would be the end of the fight, right then and there. But a true master's instinct is to push forward, not retreat. Toon watched as his opponent broke through the trap, but he wasn't done yet. With full confidence, he was already setting up his finishing blow. Just as Toon prepared to bring his blade down, something strange stopped him cold. The wooden sword his opponent had been holding was gone. Confused, he looked up and realized it had been thrown into the air. Before he could react, the wooden sword dropped perfectly back into Sansui's waiting hand. Sansui was already in a position that left Toon completely exposed. It was over in a single, impossibly precise moment. Quiet fell over the whole area as the spectators slowly realized the fight was done. Sansui said it simply with a calm smile. The duel was over. Toon took a breath and offered a genuine, gracious concession. Praise came pouring in from the witnesses, marveling at how Sansui had seemed to anticipate every move before it even began. Toon acknowledged that he had completely underestimated the Sword Saint, and that going in, he really had believed his shadow technique was unbeatable. Sansui explained that from the beginning, he had seen two possible tactics Toon might use, either a full encirclement all at once, or a staged approach designed to gradually open a gap. Meanwhile, Toon expressed genuine gratitude to Lady Palette for setting this up as a formal proceeding to resolve the conflict. Now it was Nuri's turn to make good on his word and show up to the hearing. Even though he started sweating and scrambling for excuses about pressing business, he had nowhere to run. Palette reminded him, calmly and clearly, that the deal was simple. If Town agreed, Nuri had to follow through. The stakes for Nuri climbed higher when Palette called in a curse mage from the Sabe family to ensure that honesty was enforced. The young lady, clearly delighted by the whole situation, extended an invitation to Sansui to come watch this rather unconventional proceeding play out. Elsewhere in the city, word was already spreading about the baby-faced Sword Saint's latest victory. Rain, out walking with Brower, caught pieces of conversations where curious onlookers were buzzing about the foreign swordsman who had just been beaten. Rain found herself wondering what people actually saw when they looked at the Sword Saint. Brower described him as someone who came across as surprisingly boyish and unremarkable at first glance, easy to overlook. But Rain's curiosity quickly moved on to the possibility of their lady marrying Toon. Brower noted the possibility was real, given how highly their lady had rated Town. When Rain playfully asked whether Brower herself might fall for the guy, Brower went visibly flustered, caught completely off guard by that innocent little question. Rain got a little worried that Brower might not end up marrying her dad after all. Brower sat with that for a moment, realizing that from the time she was young, she had always been so focused on serving and protecting her lady that she hadn't really developed a full understanding of what love was supposed to feel like. Still, she admitted that there had never been anyone else she had ever wanted to marry. Rain immediately lit up and told her to just go say it, to tell both her dad and her lady how she felt. Soon after, back at the Caputo estate, Rain greeted them on their return. Sansui looked absolutely drained, as if watching a curse mage conduct an interrogation had taken something out of him that was hard to explain. At the dinner table, they recounted how the curse magic worked. Anyone who lied was turned to stone. The truth that came out was that Nuri had harbored deeply dishonorable intentions toward a commoner girl, and Toon had simply been trying to stop it. The young lady said she thoroughly enjoyed watching the terror spread across Nuri's face the moment everything came to light. Palette apologized for resorting to such a heavy-handed method, but Toon actually pushed back, admitting he shared some of the blame for being stubborn and refusing to just explain the situation from the start. For Toon, going through the curse magic experience turned out to be unexpectedly meaningful. Watching someone who had done wrong have to stand there and confess it out loud, that was deeply satisfying in a way he hadn't expected. He told Palette there was nothing to feel sorry about. Toon's straightforward, principled behavior left an impression on the women in the room, but all of his attention had now shifted entirely to Sansui. He admitted that witnessing that level of swordsmanship up close had completely captivated him. Then, without warning, Toon stood up from his seat and bowed deeply before Sansui. With all the sincerity he had, he made his request to be accepted as the Sword Saint's student. Sansui was genuinely thrown off. The man had just been putting up a real fight moments ago, and now he was bowing that low, saying Sansui hadn't even shown that much. The young man introduced himself properly as Tun Majan and practically begged Sansui to take him under his wing. Faced with that kind of genuine enthusiasm, an invitation was extended. Come stay with them for a while. In the middle of that conversation, a name came up that changed everything. When asked if the name Tsunai meant anything to him, Tune confirmed immediately. That was his younger sister. The room erupted. Everyone's reaction hit at exactly the same moment as they pieced together a connection none of them had seen coming. The surprises kept coming. Tune looked genuinely shocked to learn that his sister was already engaged. He made it very clear he wasn't okay with that and intended to get to the bottom of it himself. Meanwhile, there was a lingering sense of guilt on the royal side about having involved a prince from a foreign kingdom in the whole curse. Magic proceeding, making a formal apology, feel entirely necessary. There was a brief holdup, but ultimately, the decision was made. Tune was welcome to come along with them. The hosts also felt the urgency of clearing things up as quickly as possible, and for the sake of everyone involved, that became the priority. The revelation that Tune was a prince with a clear and distinguished lineage left everyone a little stunned. At the same time, there was a complicated mix of feelings about how close they had all come to being connected to the royal family through that relationship. Sansui could only manage an awkward smile as he watched the situation get more tangled by the minute, and so they set off in a horse-drawn carriage. Destination, the Batrable estate, where Tune's sister was waiting. The departure carried with it a quiet but shared hope that the meeting ahead would clear up the misunderstandings before anything else got worse. Inside the moving carriage, Tune offered his apologies for all the complications his sister had stirred up in the Kingdom of Arcana. The response he got flipped things around. It was actually her fiancé who had caused far more headaches. The conversation then drifted toward Tune's admiration for Sansui, whom he had come to see as a true dedicated practitioner of the sword's art. Tune said he felt genuinely honored just to have the chance to learn from someone who had spent 500 years honing their craft. His ongoing bowing and deep humility made it increasingly awkward for Sansui to keep saying no. With a little nudging from the group, Sansui slowly started to come around. Even so, Sansui explained that he would need his master's permission first. He also shared something he hadn't brought up before, that he had actually been instructed not to return to the forest where his master lived until Rain reached adulthood. That restriction was the main obstacle standing between Tune and getting the training he wanted. Given that roadblock, it was decided they would go meet the master in person. The plan was to stop by Hapine's first and borrow the sacred sword Ekisax as a means of travel. In the middle of making those arrangements, Brower got gently teased about how close she had come to marrying someone now being called a living fossil. Then, out of nowhere, Brower made a sudden and heartfelt request. Could the previously paused discussion about her marriage to Sansui be reopened for consideration? That caught Sansui completely off guard and left him utterly speechless, having not expected that topic to resurface like this. The suggestion that followed was to have that conversation properly before they went to meet the master. Even though it was clear nerves were involved, an agreement was reached to sit down and talk through the details after returning to the mansion, while Sansui just quietly went along with wherever things were headed. Tune reflected that this sword saint was turning out to have a lot more depth than he ever would have guessed. Not long after, the carriage rolled to a stop in front of the imposing grounds of Batrable Mansion, the place where the heart of everything was about to be confronted. In the grand meeting hall, Tune once again expressed his embarrassment over the trouble his sister had brought to so many people. He was genuinely grateful for the gracious way they had continued to treat them as respected nobility, even with the strict expectations that came with maintaining a royal bloodline. With full composure, Tune formally apologized on behalf of his father, the king, for his sister's behavior. Even as the hosts tried to be understanding, Tune turned directly to Tsunai with a firm reprimand. He was disappointed in how she had been acting on impulse, without any thought for the longer-term consequences of her choices. Tune reminded Tsunai of her responsibilities as a future heir to the throne and the importance of thinking about what their parents would feel. He then turned his attention to Saiga, the fiancé, and offered an equally direct criticism for failing to look more carefully into the potential issues that could arise from this relationship. Saiga acknowledged the criticism and admitted it was completely fair. There was an awkward moment when it sank in just how close they had come to becoming family through that connection. The conversation then moved forward to Saiga's future role as the heir of the Batrable family. The plan to visit Sansui's master came back up, along with the need to borrow the sacred sword as part of getting permission. But the hosts and Brower were visibly taken aback when they realized that Sansui, someone who had trained for 500 years, still thought of himself as a complete beginner by his master's standards. The sacred sword Ekisax finally gave her agreement to join them. That opened the floodgates. Saiga, Tsunai, Tsunai, and Brower all declared they wanted to come too. The curiosity about meeting a legendary master like Suiboku was just too strong to ignore, even though there were some concerns about whether showing up with such a large group might come across as disrespectful to the master. Sansui reassured everyone that patience was one of Suiboku's defining qualities. They agreed on departing the following day. Underneath the relief, though, Sansui felt a quiet pressure building. He had spent 5 centuries mastering the sword, and now the whole area of romance was catching up with him faster than he knew how to handle. Rain's excitement bubbled over as she imagined how happy their great master would be when he heard the marriage news. But Brower, on the other side of the room, was quietly spiraling. She was torn. Should she wait for Sansui to make the move, or should she be the one to take the leap first? The resulting awkwardness hung in the air, leaving the people around them at a complete loss for what to say. The private meeting arranged by their employer in the hallway of the mansion felt almost unbearably tense. Sansui and Brower stood face to face in silence, both wrestling with what they were thinking. Sansui knew this was the moment. Brower kept telling herself to be brave, to not let this pass by. The second Sansui started to open his mouth, Brower got there first, with a shout that made the nervousness painfully obvious. Sansui just stared at her. Somewhere inside, he quietly noted that in 500 years across another world, this was the first time he had ever felt this kind of intensity with a woman. Too far gone in embarrassment to pull together anything remotely romantic, Brower skipped straight to demanding that Sansui take responsibility for where things stood between them. The request landed with full confusion because Sansui genuinely had no idea what responsibility she was talking about. From a safe distance, Rain and their employer watched the whole thing play out with completely flat expressions, both silently agreeing this was about as far from romantic as it could possibly get. Time passed. The night turned into morning at the Dewey estate, and a new chapter was ready to begin. The next morning, Sansui calmly announced their decision to get married. The news landed like a surprise on all of his friends. Brower, still deeply embarrassed by everything that had happened the night before, made it very clear she had no interest in walking anyone through what had gone on, and swiftly changed the subject. With blessings and full support given, the group got ready to head out. Their destination was Sir Suiboku, who was somewhere at the edge of the Arcana Kingdom's forest. A quick farewell, and then the journey began. Moving through the dense forest, congratulations kept finding their way to Brower, who accepted them with soft, bashful deflections. As they went deeper in, people started wondering out loud how much farther they actually had to go. All they knew was keep walking into the forest to find the great master. Ekasax began to wonder aloud whether Suiboku would even want to see her after everything, after being left behind for so long. Sansui offered a different way of seeing it. He didn't believe Suiboku had abandoned her. More likely, his master had simply reached a point where he no longer needed the power of a weapon to define his strength. Then, without warning, the person they had been looking for stepped out from behind a tree. Suiboku looked strikingly young, which surprised everyone. He explained that the reason he had kept his distance all this time was that he hadn't wanted to be seen in a state he wasn't proud of, but he had finally crossed the threshold into what he would call a true hermit. The reunion carried real emotion as Suiboku welcomed his old sword back. He also took the time to give Sansui genuine praise for the way he had raised Rain into such a remarkable young person, and for finding a partner worth holding onto. Then Suiboku gave a small demonstration of his ability. In a movement too fast for the eye to track, he was suddenly in a completely different position, without making contact with a single person in the group. The move was called the flash step, and both Brower and the others were left completely breathless by what they had just witnessed. After that brief showing, Suiboku led them to a simple pile of stones. It was the resting place of the woman who had given everything to protect Rain. With quiet reverence, Rain knelt down and offered her prayers. From there, the conversation turned to the philosophy of strength. Suiboku reflected that what it means to be the strongest looks different to everyone. For him, Sansui, as he was now, represented the truest form of what a swordsman's ideals should look like. Someone reliable, someone worth following. He elaborated on how Sansui possessed complete control over his abilities, knowing equally well when to win and when to show mercy. That discipline in training, that clarity of vision, and that quiet presence of mind Those things, Suiboku said, were the real core of what it meant to carry a sword. He went on to speak about humility, gratitude, and the willingness to share what you know with those who are ready to receive it. Saiga, listening to every word, felt something stir deep inside, his admiration for Sansui reaching a whole new level. With real conviction, Saiga declared his desire to grow stronger under Sansui's guidance. The calm of that moment was briefly interrupted when Suiboku recalled something. A group of people who had come to that gravesite looking for a young child. The news of someone searching for a baby who had gone missing 5 years ago stirred up immediate concern. The group began to piece together possible motives behind the search, with the Domino Empire quickly coming to mind as a likely candidate. A quiet but unmistakable sense of dread began to settle over all of them, the feeling that something was out there and it was already looking